very open to receiving international assistance. Japan had been widely criticized after the Kobe earthquake in 1995 about being slow or even hesitant to accept foreign aid. And this time, I think the Japanese acted appropriately and took that overseas help. I think in the days that have gone by since, we've seen a lot of wonderful examples, in particular of local government officials in Japan who have done an amazing job, who've really sacrificed tremendously in terms of their personal lives to do their work. And I think this is incredibly impressive. City Hall has a bad reputation in Japan, as it does in the United States. Most people don't like local government all that much. And yet I think a lot of these local officials have really been quite remarkable in this time of crisis, keeping their communities together. Of course, there have been problems, and we've seen them in the news. In many ways, the Japanese sort of administrative culture, the bureaucratic culture, the corporate culture are not well organized for responding quickly to significant changes. And so I think we've seen some of that in the Japanese government's response. We've seen the stories, I think, about how fuel companies have maintained emergency reserves of gasoline in a time when clearly is an emergency, and they should have been letting those out to the public, but they've continued to do that because no one in the government has told them they can release their emergency reserves and so forth. I think on the part of individuals, of course, in Japan, we have seen a remarkable outpouring of generosity and activity, and also a remarkable sense of commitment to community in the wake of this earthquake. I think we've all seen stories of people in Tokyo just loading their cars up with water and food and bedding and so forth, and just driving north with the hope of finding people who need this kind of relief. And I was struck by a story I was told by a friend just about a week ago. She had been planning for years to have a vacation with an aunt of hers from Ibaraki Prefecture, which is just to the north of Tokyo, and it's a little bit closer to the earthquake zone than Tokyo is. So this aunt and her had been planning to have a vacation in Hawaii for years, and they had planned it for the beginning of April this year. And after the earthquake, my friend called up her aunt, and her aunt said, "You know, the house is fine. The retaining wall in the back fell down. The water was off for a few days, but now everything's back to normal. But I just don't think I can come on the vacation. And it's not that I feel guilty about the vacation, it's that I don't want to leave my community at this time of stress. I feel wrong being away from my friends and neighbors." And I think that gives a wonderful sense of the way people have pulled together in this time of crisis. Now, in the days after the quake and the tsunami, I was asked several questions repeatedly, both in the media and just around town by friends and colleagues. One of these questions was, why is there no looting in Japan? My response to this is, this just shows how sad things are in America rather than how great things are in Japan. That this is one of the first questions that comes to mind. And I was asked on one radio call-in show whether there was an underclass in Japan. And there really is not. Even though Japan has become a more polarized society in many ways over the past couple decades, Japan still doesn't have that kind of permanent underclass, which we see in so many American cities, and certainly in so much of the developing world. And so that idea of why no looting, this never entered my mind. I never would have thought about that in the Japanese case, because I really can't imagine it happening. The other thing that people ask me a lot is, why are the Japanese people so calm and dignified in the face of such a tremendous disaster? And this is really a difficult question to answer. I think a lot of the people in the media, just sort of in a knee-jerk way, ascribed it to Japanese culture. Okay? That there's something about the way Japanese are, and it goes with the sort of politeness and the order and the hierarchy in Japanese society, that the Japanese just naturally, of course, deal with a crisis like this in stride. Okay, and they deal with it calmly. Okay. There are other parts to that, and I think Yuri showed us one part of it this evening. Training is a major issue. Being prepared for a disaster like this in terms of, you know, down to where we're going to meet 3 days from now, having your passport ready to take. Are you kidding me? It's amazing. Okay, you know, this kind of training helps people psychologically as well. I think what a lot of historians would stress when they look at the response of the Japanese people is, in fact, the kind of discipline imposed by the Japanese state on the Japanese populace has a major effect in conditioning the people's response in a time of crisis like this. That the Japanese state historically, and this is going back the last 150 years or so, has been so systematic in regimenting the Japanese people and helping Japanese society become ordered, and many would say malleable, okay, that this kind of systematic government training really prepared Japan extraordinarily well for this time of disaster. And one of the primary places this would take place, of course, is in the schools. That a very regimented, organized educational system that has people all facing the same direction and behaving in certain prescribed ways was incredibly important in making sure that everyone behaved in an orderly fashion. And then I, of course, coming from my particular background, working on Japanese popular culture, would advise not to underestimate the impact of having rehearsed disaster so many times in Japanese popular culture over the past 70 years. Since World War II, the theme of apocalypse has been a very powerful one in Japanese popular culture. From the Godzilla film starting in 1954 through anime, manga, video games, fiction. There's an amazing book and 2 movies made from it called Japan Sinks, in which it's a book in the 1970s. It came out right in the wake of the oil crisis, when Japanese were very sensitive to the vulnerability of their nation. And the story essentially is that a vast series of seismological events, volcanoes, earthquakes, followed then by typhoons, you know, every bad thing that can happen, sweeps over Japan, and Japan literally disappears under the water. Okay? And the Japanese people have to be removed to other countries. You know, I would say that this experience of having seen Japan, and particularly Tokyo, destroyed so many times in fantasy, helped prepare the Japanese psychologically for the reality of it happening in 2011. Let me just briefly then touch on what lies ahead for Japan, because the unprecedented scale of this disaster presents unprecedented challenges. One huge problem, of course, is leadership. Okay, who is going to lead Japan in the weeks and months ahead? Japan is renowned these days for having an unstable political system. Okay, you can barely count the number of prime ministers that Japan has had over the past 20 years. Their terms in office are calculated now in weeks or months rather than in years. The major political party that has dominated Japanese politics since World War II was turfed out of office, and now there is a new political party in charge, a political party that doesn't have deep reserves of experience running the country, that doesn't have a good relationship with the powerful government bureaucracy, that doesn't have a particularly good relationship with the business community or with other entrenched interests. And so there's a lot of concern about who is really going to carry Japan forward at this point. And I think these are significant concerns, because while Japan has still managed to rally together a month after the disaster, given the divisiveness and fractures within the Japanese political system over the past few decades, it seems to me that this sort of at least temporary consensus is going to break down fairly quickly. It does not bode well considering the scale of the task ahead if there is no clear leadership at the top. The economic challenge, of course, is going to be a huge one. The price tag for this disaster keeps going up and up. What I heard on the radio today was $350 billion, which in some ways doesn't seem like very much in a $4.5 trillion economy, and yet that certainly is a huge amount, and I'm guessing that total is going to go up over time as well. Add to this the fact that the Japanese government has already maxed out all of its national credit cards Japan is one of the most highly indebted nations in the world already. There's not much room to borrow more money. That leaves taxation as really the primary means to raise the funds necessary to rebuild the country. The economy's been in the doldrums since 1990, and increased taxation is probably not going to be the best stimulus to move things forward. So even though we will see a lot of construction activity in the Northeast, one has the concern that this will depress the Japanese economy in general. The impact on international relations, I think, is an interesting one and something we should reflect on. One of the things that was striking was how quickly after the quake both China and South Korea sent aid to Japan. And I think South Korea in particular has shown remarkable generosity and remarkable support of Japan. And in both cases, of course, Japan has had historically a very fraught relationship, due largely to Japanese imperialism and colonialism in China and Korea in the mid-20th century. On a positive note, one might hope that this will lead to some warming of relations between Japan and its Asian neighbors. And I would like to believe that's the case. However, I was reminded in talking to a colleague recently that if we go back to 1923, and 1923, as you may remember, is the date of the Great Kanto earthquake, the earthquake that destroyed Tokyo and Yokohama. In the wake of the Great Kanto earthquake, the United States really rallied in a remarkable way to supply aid to Japan. It was calculated that 70% of the foreign aid that flowed into Japan after 1923 came from the United States. And a remarkable percentage of US GDP in the year after 1923, something like 0.4% of US GDP was given as aid to Japan. Okay? And this was collected by kids on the playgrounds, by large corporations, by the government, and so forth. So that was in 1923 to 1924, America gave a huge amount of aid to Japan. And there's a quotation this friend of mine mentioned to me, given by a Japanese political leader at that time, saying, surely the scale of this generosity from America to Japan at Japan's time of true need will guarantee that America and Japan will remain friends forever. Okay? Fast forward 17 years, I think we know what happens then. So just because there is some temporary warming of relations between China and South Korea and Japan in the wake of this tremendous natural and human disaster doesn't necessarily mean the story's going to end happily for all. For me, one of the key questions is, how is the younger generation in Japan going to respond to this disaster? To be honest, the youth in Japan these days don't have a very good reputation. Okay? A lot, especially of members of the older generation in Japan, see youth today as being very unfocused, not particularly hardworking. I think all of us white hairs in the audience can understand this sentiment. Oh, the young people today are so, fill in the blank. Okay? But I think the youth in Japan today have gotten a lot of criticism from the elites for not having enough focus and drive. This is, I think, a defining moment for the young generation in Japan. How are they going to respond to this crisis? We saw in the wake of the 1995 Kobe earthquake a huge upsurge in volunteerism in Japan. In fact, historians will say 1995 really was the beginning of volunteerism on a mass scale in Japan. And after 1995, one sees, for example, this huge growth in NGOs operating in Japan. I think it's going to be interesting to watch in the coming months and years to see what role the younger generation takes in charting Japan's reconstruction. Because now I think is the moment for them to step forward and really leave a mark. I think in doing so, they would surprise a lot of people in Japan, and I think they could really have a huge impact on the course that Japan takes. I will just say, the best evidence I have that the younger generation in Japan is going to rise to this challenge and really make a difference is the work done by the Japanese students here at SMU in organizing this event. in coming together with such energy and such focus, and clearly, as this room shows, such success in trying to make a difference. So this very event makes me optimistic about the future of Japan. In the end, what I think we need to keep in mind about the crises in Japan is how it underlines how interconnected we all are today as citizens of the world. I mean, I was just struck by this. I probably watched more computer-generated animations in the past month than I have in the rest of my life altogether. I'm sure Brian will show us more in a minute. But you see these sort of seismic waves sweeping around the globe. And they may start off the coast of Japan, but soon they cover the whole planet. You've probably seen the sort of tracks of the radiation coming from Fukushima and drifting over the Pacific, and then eventually moving around the globe. One of the most recent ones I watched was of debris from the tsunami, being washed into the Pacific, then moving across, going around the west coast, coming back around, hitting Hawaii, and then going into that North Pacific dead zone. You see the way in which this the effects of what happened in Japan, from the shaking of the earth to the radiation sent up into the atmosphere to the building materials put into the ocean, don't affect just Japan, don't affect just us, but affect eventually the entire world. And I was really struck by this. I spent the last 17 years of my life in Kansas, and so I still occasionally look at the newspapers from Kansas. So I was looking at the Lawrence, Kansas Journal World the other day, where there was a big front of the website story on how radiation from Japan had been detected in Kansas. Okay? How they did this, why anyone cares, who knows? But just this sense of connection, okay? Something that came out of that reactor in Fukushima had landed in Kansas. Shows how the world has become small. And that really made me think, too, about this idea of the universality of disaster and of suffering. I think one of the events that my wife and I experienced in Kansas, thankfully from a distance, was the tornado that ripped through Greensburg and destroyed Greensburg. And it took me a while to sort of come around to think about the pictures I was seeing from northern Japan and the reality I'd seen in western Kansas several years earlier, and yet was struck by how similar those two situations were. Seeing the earth scrubbed clear by a wave on the one hand, and seeing the earth scrubbed clear by wind on the other. And NPR did a wonderful story then a couple weeks ago, talking to survivors of Greensburg and why they decided to stay and rebuild in that town. And you got this sense of the incredible pain, the incredible sense of effort which it took to start again from zero, seeing their entire community wiped away. But this sense that this is something they had to do, and this is something they had to do not just for themselves, but for their friends and for the other people who were there around them, for the community. Okay? And so I think that's the sense of universality we see in this, is not just the universal that we're all vulnerable, but the universal that we're all also tied together in our local communities and in the global whole. And of course, I'd have to say, one of the things that also shows those global ties is events like tonight. That even here in Dallas, Texas, which in many ways seems so far from the disaster and so safe in many ways, that even here we can feel for what's happening on the other side of the world. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tsutsui. And next, we will have the Dr. Brian Stump from the Algorithm Professor of Earth Science at Dedman College of Roy, I'm really sorry. Roy Huffington Department of Earth Science. It's really long. So from the Earth Sciences. All right.
Change this word. Because Bill was right. I'm going to show some images to probably many of the two. right. First of all, I'd like to thank Yuri and the group for inviting me to come along and talk a little bit about the earthquake itself. And I'm